Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm your host, Kerry Simmons, and welcome to Everyday Eerie, the podcast where the ordinary meets the extraordinary. Dive into the world of ghost stories, haunted objects, eerie places, and unsolved mysteries that will send shivers down your spine. Each week, we explore the tales that blur the line between the living and the dead, the known and the unknown. So turn down the lights, settle in, and prepare to be spooked. So on today's episode, we are continuing on with our series on haunted Charleston, South Carolina. Now, if you missed part 1, go ahead and check that out as well. There were some cool stories in that episode. But like I said in that episode, Charleston is just a city that's so, rich in history and hauntings. It gives me no shortage of content. So we have this part 2, and then there's going to be one more part 3 coming after this. And then we'll kind of take a little bit of a break from Charleston and move on to something a little bit different. Not to say that there aren't plenty of stories that I could keep telling. We might circle back to it at a later time, but I think that part 3, this part, and then another part after this would be sufficient for now. So we are going to start with our first story, and this takes us to our next location, to Drayton Hall. So Drayton Hall is a large plantation home which is situated a bit outside the main historic district, so about 12 miles north of the historic district, and it sits along the Ashley River. Now, Drayton Hall was first established by John Drayton. John Drayton was a very successful rice plantation owner. He actually owned about 76,000 acres in total amongst all of his little plantation empires. So he first purchased the land and began building on it in 1738, and building of the home was said to be completed by about 1742. It's interesting because this house has been passed down from generation to generation in the same family, which in and of itself is unique, that it hadn't really changed hands for a very, very long time, up until it was purchased by, the city of Charleston and made the tourist attraction and made it into a museum like it is today. So it was constructed in what is known as the Palladian-style, which is different from some of the other southern plantations, which hold more of a traditional like antebellum style. So the Palladian-style is characterized by a home with more symmetry, kind of more of a classical feel, usually a very symmetrical facade that has columns in the front made out of brick or stone, and Drayton Hall is actually made out of brick. So it's a little bit more reminiscent of an English manor house versus what you would traditionally see in a typical southern plantation home. And this house really wasn't used as a working plantation. It really wasn't used for commercial production of goods, but really more so as a headquarters or like a commercial center for John Drayton's other plantation empires. So Drayton Hall has withstood over 250 years of American history, including the Revolutionary War, multiple hurricanes, earthquakes, the Civil War, and it still stands to this day. Now, one of the other unique things about this home is that it is very much preserved, and that little has actually been changed or refurbished. So naturally, as wear and tear happens to these historic homes, restoration practices will take place to bring them back to the specifications of their time. But this really has not been done at Drayton Hall. So obviously they have done things to, make sure that the home is safe for people to come and to visit. So ensuring that stairs and flooring are safe to walk on. But no running water or electric has ever been added to the home, and other things in the home are not replicas, but are more so original to the home. So for example, fireplace mantles date back to 1803. The paint on the walls itself dates back 200 years. The carved plaster ceilings date back to 1742 when the home was completed. And in general, the place has been completely kept as is. And this is maybe why the ghosts of Drayton Hall feel so comfortable, because it still feels like the home they once knew. Now, people who have worked in the home have mentioned the feeling of not being alone, feeling of being kind of watched through the corridors as they're walking down a hall. They'll feel like someone is peeking out of the rooms behind them. One of the employees in particular, who reportedly was always a skeptic, never paying too much attention to the ghost stories, had an experience where a woman who touted herself as a psychic was walking up the stairs and almost collapsed with grief as she was experiencing this really intense sadness. And she reported feeling like a mother whose baby had just passed away. And in that same moment, this employee who was a skeptic also began to feel this rush and wave of intense sadness, and suddenly felt herself begin to cry. This experience seemed to just take over her body. It was like she was watching herself in a movie. Like she for no rhyme or reason was crying. Couldn't understand why she was crying, only that she felt an intense grief and sadness, and also shared in this feeling of tragedy. So after that, she felt like she was kind of changed by the experience, and then she began to take other people's stories a little bit more seriously. She was no longer a skeptic at that point. Now, there are two spirits in particular that make their presence more known, and one is that of the oldest son of John Drayton, named William Henry Drayton. When one of the employees was driving up toward the property during after hours, he and a few others in the car with him saw in one of the upstairs windows a man in period clothing staring out onto the dirt road leading up to the house. So if you can imagine this again, the house is very symmetrical, right? So if you think of one big square with 4 or so columns in the front, upstairs windows were all symmetrical between what's happening on the left side of the house and the right side of the house, and then there was, there's windows right in the middle. So they see this man staring right out of the middle windows, and all of a sudden he turns towards his right side, and then they see him go past the second window and the third window in what was or would have been the ballroom. The groundskeeper was just coming out of the house at the front doors, and so they asked him if anyone else was there, and the groundskeeper confirmed that he had just come from inside and no one was there but him. At least no one living. There's also another strange presence that is felt and seen in a nearby hidden stairwell. Now, each time this presence is felt, there's an immediate feeling again of tragedy. So no one has ever been able to pinpoint if this has something to do with the stairwell, if someone fell over the stairwell, if someone passed on the stairs, if there was a tragedy having to do with the stairs at all, or if it's kind of a coincidence as to why they feel that kind of tragic feeling in this area. But John Drayton had 2 sons from a previous marriage who both did pass sadly before the age of 2. The causes around these deaths are not really known. They don't know if this could have been tragedy. I mean, of course it was tragedy because they were so young, but they're not sure if this was like a tragic accident, like a freak accident, such as a fall down the stairs or something of that nature, or if it was an illness or what have you. So they haven't exactly been able to pinpoint it, but they're thinking that there could be a little bit of a correlation between the stairwell and the 2 sons. And now the same psychic who first felt this sadness and again had that feeling of a mother who just lost their baby had these visions of 2 small coffins, which they think may have been the coffins of the 2 young boys. Now, Drayton Hall was featured on the Travel Channel's America's Most Haunted Places in 2003, which I'm sure you can still look up to watch today if you're interested. Now, aside from ghost stories and historic architecture, Charleston is well known for its cuisine. Now, they have a large variety of different types of foods, but certainly no shortage of those cooking up some authentic Southern food, and one of these restaurants is called Coogan's Porch, which takes us to the location of our next ghost story. So there are a couple different renditions of how the restaurant got its name. In one story, the original owners of the then house at 72 Queen Street left in such a hurry that they left their wiry, white-haired little dog, who waited on the porch for their return, which is so sad, only to be adopted by the new owners, who decided to turn it into a restaurant. Now, another rendition is that Coogan This dog was a stray who, upon revamping the home into a restaurant, would come to beg for food from the workers during lunch hours. And so they would make a joke that, he was always there sitting on the porch waiting for him, that it wasn't the owner's house, it was Coogan's house. So either way, the dog, who passed in the 1970s, became sort of a mascot for the restaurant. And after his passing, some have reported seeing the white, wispy shape of the dog roaming around the grounds. The Coogan's Porch ghost history goes beyond that of the sweet little puppy. It's most notorious, actually, for a woman named Zoe. Now, Zoe lived at the house with her sister Elizabeth in the early 1900s, so the house was built in 1886 originally. And Zoe was a local school teacher who pretty well, along with her sister, were the town spinsters. So they were older, they had never been married, and pretty well gave up on that dream. Zoe was always seen wearing a black dress with thin framed glasses, and she kept to herself, staying mostly inside in the comfort of her home with Elizabeth. I didn't really know this, but, school teachers made very little money at that time, and I didn't realize that in this day and age, being a school teacher basically meant that the state had control over your dating life, so you were not allowed to date or marry, as this was seen as potentially dragging you away from your duties as a teacher, which is absolutely ridiculous, but nonetheless, that was kind of the life that you signed up for. So this kept them fairly isolated. Now, people in town were really cruel to them, as they typically were to spinsters. As spinsters, you were just sort of seen as a bit less than, kind of oddballs. So the women were each other's best companions, and they were very, very close. Now, in 1945, Elizabeth would go on to pass away due to illness, and this obviously was very tragic for Zoe, because now she was truly feeling alone in the world. So this cascaded into a very deep depression and her suffering mental health. Ultimately, one night, about 9 years later, Zoe left her house in a craze, screaming for her sister, to the point where her neighbors decided to take her to a local hospital, where she ended up spending the rest of her days before being buried in St. Lawrence Cemetery in Charleston with her sister and her parents. Now, after her passing, her spirit was reportedly seen by neighbors walking around the home and looking out of the windows, always wearing her same black dress and thin-framed glasses. But these reports really amped up when construction began to convert the home to the restaurant, and they continue to this day. Multiple staff members for Coogan's Porch have had encounters with Zoe, as have guests of the restaurant. Now, on one occasion, a guest was going to the restroom when she came across a woman in a black dress with thin glasses. She assumed that someone had dressed up and was just in keeping with some of the local history, until she passed a wall. And when she glanced on that wall to look at some of the pictures of the old home, she sees a black and white photo of Zoe. And at this point, she knew that she had encountered Zoe's ghost. Now, Zoe's ghost has also been seen out of the corner of people's eyes, sitting at one of the tables in the back, but when people turn to get a better look, she disappears and is no longer there. People often hear bangs and crashes in the kitchen when no one's there. Obviously, kitchens during, work hours at a restaurant are very busy and noisy, but this often happens in the early hours before everybody is in, when just the pastry chef and the head chef, when they're just in for the day, they'll hear things banging around and crashing in the kitchen. One night when the owner was locking up, she was going to set the alarm when she heard one of the wooden stools in the restaurant being knocked over. And after investigating this, one of the doors also began to shake and rattle and open and close really violently. So this certainly spooked her. And on other multiple occasions, managers would hear similar noises, banging and things like that, coming from downstairs. And every time they would go down to investigate, no one would be there. One of the more interesting stories comes from a man named Isaac Vanderhorst, who's a longtime chef for Coogan's Porch. And so he reported an incident where he came into work, and because he was early, he poured himself a cup of coffee. And just then, the guy delivering produce for the restaurant began knocking on the door. So he left his coffee cup to open the door, and upon coming back to retrieve it, found it to be gone. Totally disappeared. So he started kind of looking around for it. He's like, but I know I left it here. So he kind of shrugged his shoulders, went back to the kitchen and poured himself another cup. And when he returned to the same spot, his original coffee cup was back, but now with a lipstick stain on it. So this caused him to rush outside the restaurant. He's like, absolutely not. He noped the F out of there to wait for his fellow colleagues as he was super spooked. And he reported on multiple occasions he would feel a cold presence kind of brush past him, behind him while in the kitchen. And while he felt it was Zoe, he refused to turn around because he did not want to find out for sure. So if you're ever in town and want to try some of the local cuisine and possibly experience a ghostly encounter, Coogan's Porch is a great option. So next on the list is College of Charleston, a college situated right in the downtown area. And this is actually where I went to school for my undergrad degree, and I stayed in the dorm room that I will be talking about. So College of Charleston was founded in 1770, and it is the oldest educational institution in the South, and actually the 13th oldest in the United States. It was founded by at least 3 of the founding fathers who signed the Declaration of Independence, and it was used for multiple purposes throughout history, including during the Revolutionary War to keep prisoners of war. So in keeping with the rest of Charleston, the main and original buildings have been preserved to maintain its historic nature and charm. Now, College of Charleston has a history of ghostly encounters in multiple areas, but one of them more significant, that's going to be our story today, is at Drayton Hall, which is an all-girls dorm. So Drayton Hall was built over the site of the old Charleston orphanage house. This to me is like straight up a red flag off the bat, but it was built over the site of the orphanage house, and it had been documented that in 1918, the hospital in the orphanage, or the infirmary, which it was referred to, was overflowing with sick children due to the Spanish flu pandemic. So they were super busy. What started out as kind of a smaller orphanage ended up growing and growing and growing. So there were a lot of children being housed here, and then a lot of them ended up with the Spanish flu, and it spread pretty quickly. And unfortunately, it would go on to take some of the lives of the children. But the children who were not sick were spending a lot more time outdoors as a way of keeping the spread at bay, and because the staff members were just so busy caring for the sick children inside. So they were often kind of, allowed to roam around and had to make do with whatever they could find to play and to keep themselves busy. So they would often find cardboard boxes from local trash cans and make tents out of them. But on one day in particular, the kids who were not sick were sent outside in the yard again when a few of them came across some oily rags. And for whatever reason, a few of them decided to set them on fire, which spread to the cardboard boxes and caused a fire to the grounds that quickly spread to the main house. And this is where 4 orphans between the ages of 8 and 13 would pass from smoke inhalation. Now, the building was first bought by Sears, though this was very short-lived, and it quickly became part of College of Charleston afterwards. Now, since the opening of Drayton Hall, students have often been plagued with false fire alarms, which I can totally attest to, as there were several occasions when the fire alarms would go off in the middle of the night, which were particularly annoying, as we had to jump out of bed and wait outside, sometimes in the cold, until the fire department would come and check things out. They were never able to find a cause of these faulty alarms, and it would always happen in the middle of the night, and nothing ever came from it. But they started to the joke was out there that it was just the ghosts of the orphanage setting the alarms off. Now, on multiple other occasions, residents would hear a laughter or the sounds of running up and down the hallways, only to open the doors and see no one in immediate vision. I did a few times hear random laughing and a lot of movement up and down the halls to find the halls relatively empty, but I never thought too much of it until I found out the history of the building. Because, it's an all-girls dorm. I figured there's just some people, some girls giggling up and down the hall. So I never really gave it too much of a thought. But then when I did learn about the history and that other people had these experiences too, I started to wonder a little bit if those laughs were actually coming from children. Now, random young voices have been heard both throughout the hallways and in the courtyard in the early hours of the morning, with some people reporting hearing what sounded kind of like marbles being rolled across like a wooden floor at random times of day. And the halls were not made of wood. There were no wooden floors in the building. Everything was kind of like you would expect from a dorm, where there was carpeted areas and then more like tiled areas. So definitely not wood, but people would multiple people would say that it sounded like, yes, like marbles rolling across the floor, where it would kind of be this like deep sound that would start far away, come a little bit closer, and then start to recede in the distance. But no marbles obviously were ever found. But this is interesting because, you know, it would have been a time period where playing marbles was common, and even more so amongst those that had a little bit less money. So it's not something unusual. It's something that you actually probably would have expected to find the kids in the orphanage playing with. Now, a few other witnesses reported hearing the chanting of Ring Around the Rosie, which I had never heard, but I can assure you that if I had, that would be a wrap for me. That song is creepy on a good day, let alone when sung by the voices of ghostly children. That I won't play with. I can deal with the laughing, I can deal with the sounds outside running up and down, I can deal with the marbles, I could deal with, you know, the fire alarms, but Ring Around the Rosie, I draw the line. That's where I draw the line. So, you know, I hear stories like this and had a few weird experiences here myself, and I always go back to the eerie theory that we had kind of talked about in some of the earlier episodes, that Ed Warren had said that God would not allow children to remain as ghosts. And I go back and forth on this one. I go back and forth because are these sounds coming from something more sinister that's attempting to impersonate children, or are we simply hearing the sounds of the past that have kind of been imprinted on this area, like in a parallel universe kind of thing? I don't know. I haven't been able to make up my mind about which I feel is true. So I'd love to hear some thoughts on this too, because I've always kind of grappled with this one and gone back and forth. Because you, like I said, like you hear stories like this, or stories where a child has, you know, tragically passed and people see their ghost or feel their presence. And then, yeah, but what Ed Warren says does also seem true, that, you know, children are sacred and children are special and important and innocent. And so I totally would believe the idea that God wouldn't just allow them to be stuck here or remain here as ghosts unless there's reasons why ghosts are still here that has to do more so with their control versus being outside of their control. Maybe they're not stuck here, maybe they choose to stay, maybe, like I said, we're working with like a parallel universe and kind of hearing the sounds of the past because they're imprinted in this area, on the grounds, in the buildings, in the walls. I don't know, it's interesting, and I do go back and forth with that one a lot. So that's why I've always felt like the stories that incorporate like ghosts of children are particularly creepy, because I'm not sure if it's a real child or not, or if we're dealing with like an Annabelle type situation. But it's not like any of the ghosts here that have been reported have like appeared to anyone or tried to gain anyone's trust. They've just sort of made noise. So I also feel like if it was something demonic, why wouldn't it be trying to gain someone's trust in some way? So I don't know. I'd like to hear people's thoughts on that, because it's always been interesting. But moving on to another building on campus at College of Charleston is 12 Glebe Street. So it's also said to be haunted. I tried to find some background information on the house. I went through the Charleston Historic Foundation, but there really wasn't much to go off of other than that it was constructed in 1855. But according to College of Charleston records, the house was purchased by the school in the 1960s, and when workers had entered the home to begin sort of reconstructing the inside, they found that the previous owners had created multiple mazes throughout the home with random rooms and staircases that would be sealed up at certain ends, making it really confusing for them to walk through. So this really gives me like Winchester Mystery House vibes. But the house was converted to a guest house once the restoration of the inside was finished. So one night when a couple of the guests were laying in bed reading, they heard a strange noise at the foot of the bed, and upon looking up to see what had caused it, they saw a man who looked to be about 6 feet tall, who was well dressed with a, quote, fluffy tie, standing there. The apparition opened his mouth as if to try to say something to the couple, but no words were coming out. He then had a face of exasperation and annoyance and turned to walk through one of the walls in the bedroom. Now, some people believe that the visions of ghosts throughout the home is what made the previous homeowner set up all the mazes to confuse them. But I'm not really sure if it was just this one ghost or if they were experiencing multiple ghosts, but the only reported apparition was this, what they call like the miming ghost, because each time that he has been seen, he's been trying to speak and no words come out of his mouth. And then he always looks annoyed that he is unable to communicate with the people he is appearing to, and he ends up walking out of the bedroom. So that was interesting to me, because you don't often hear that, where the ghost is trying to say something to you and almost acknowledging the fact that there's a disconnect between his world and ours, where he almost looks annoyed, like, oh, I wish that I could communicate this with them and they can't hear me either. And he keeps trying and trying and trying in hopes that he comes across someone who can hear him or can understand him. And he never does, and he always seems annoyed at that. So that was interesting, because again, it raises the question of why ghosts are ghosts, how many ghosts know they're ghosts, the difference in the different types of hauntings that there are, the residual hauntings versus the things that are more malicious, or the ones that maybe recognize that there are other people in the home and haunt them and appear to them, versus the ones that kind of are just like walking around doing their own thing, like Denny Dickinson in the last episode, where she's always seen sort of looking off into the distance, kind of straight shot, doesn't really look at people as she's appearing to them, so to speak, like it's not purposeful. But this ghost in particular, it seems like he tries to appear to people and tries to communicate with people, which is a little bit of a different situation. So that one was pretty interesting. Now, the last story that we're going to talk about today, definitely not the last out there again, but the last one we'll talk about today, takes place at St. Michael's Church and is known as the story of the dead bride. Now, Harriet Mackey was a local woman whose mother died from yellow fever when she was very young. Her father at that point was nervous about how he would raise a young lady to ensure that she would behave in a way that would give her good prospects for marriage. As he was worried about this, he ended up making a deal with a local rice plantation, a competitor, if you will, as his fortune was also made from owning and operating rice plantations, that she would marry one of their sons. Now, Harriet was only 11 years old at the time. Obviously, she did not like the idea at the time, but he thought, she's 11, his daughter, she'll come around. But this unfortunately did not happen, as Harriet was still unconvinced when she became of age to marry. She had hopes of marrying for love. She didn't want to be married off to somebody that she, hardly knew and didn't love. But when her father was very ill, he decided to amend his will and told her that if she could find another suitable prospect within 30 days, that once married, her and her new husband would inherit his fortune and be the heirs to this rice plantation. But if she did not find anyone in that time frame, the old will still stood, and the conditions were that she would marry the son of the neighboring plantation, who, along with his family, would inherit their fortune. Now, as it turns out, Harriet did fall in love. She probably was talking to this guy throughout this entire time, probably already had someone in mind, but she fell in love with a friend from childhood, and they quickly became engaged, with a wedding date set for just 10 days after her father had passed. So overall, her future was pretty bright at this point. She was young, she was healthy, she was set to marry the love of her life. They would inherit a great fortune and a great business. Sadly, though, just a few days before her wedding, Harriet was found dead, with the cause of death being poisoning, leaving her fiancé completely heartbroken. She was only 17 years old. She was buried in her wedding dress, and while laid out during the mourning period, a French artist who was a well-known miniature painter painted her in a locket that also contains a lock of her hair with an inscription that describes the tragic end to her life. Now, though no one was ever formally caught, locals suspected that the neighboring competitors were angry that she found someone to marry and that they were no longer up for her fortune, and killed her, ensuring that they would still inherit the property and the fortune, which they did. Now, she was buried in St. Michael's Church Cemetery, with some reporting seeing the spirit of a young woman walking amongst the gravestones, while others report seeing her inside the church during weddings as a sort of omen. So the story goes that if she is seen, she is warning the bride and disapproves of the marriage. If she is not, she is happy with the couple and she wishes you well on your wedding day. So that concludes our episode today on Haunted Charleston. Be sure to check out my Instagram page, and don't forget to send a personal ghost story to everydayerie26@gmail.com. And thank you again for joining me on this journey into the eerie and unexplained. I hope these stories captivated your imagination and that you will join me next time for more tales of the strange and supernatural. Until then, keep an eye out for the eerie in your everyday.